depending on where in the world you are joining from today. My name is Eric Kimberling here for our weekly Tuesday live streams. Thanks for joining us here today. Today's topic is going to be the psychology of digital transformation, among other things, but that'll be sort of the main thread we'll cover here is the psychology of digital transformation, how people are affected, individual motives and behavior and cultures and things of that nature, identities. We're going to cover a lot of different aspects of how digital transformations affect people and how people affect digital transformations. So if you're interested in the organizational human side of change, this will be a good conversation for you. I'm going to introduce my guest here in a moment who has a PhD and is a professor at Colorado State University here in Colorado, where I'm based and where Third Stage is based. I'm going to introduce her in a moment, but before I do, we are streaming to all the major platforms here today on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. So thanks everyone for joining here today. And if you could, while we're getting started here, just drop in the chat where in the world you're joining us from here today, just so we can get a sense of the audience and where you're joining from. So be sure to drop that in the chat if you don't mind. That would be super helpful just to know what city or country you're joining from here today. And so the other thing I'll mention too is as we get going here, I have a sort of a list of questions I want to get to, but what's more important than my questions is going to be the questions that the audience has. So if you have any questions along the way for our guest or myself, be sure to chime in and drop those in the chat. We'd love to hear your comments here as we get going here. So to get started again, then I guess I'd like to introduce Dr. Christina Serrano, who is at Colorado State University. And rather than trying to explain your background, Christina, maybe I'll let you do that instead. But first of all, welcome to the show and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I saw Kyler's message in the chat, go Rams, and I just want to echo that, go Rams. So so just a little bit about myself. I do have a PhD. My field is management information systems. I got my PhD from the University of Georgia, the Terry College of Business. And but my first degree was actually public health as an undergrad. So I have this very mixed background where I really have a love for public health and health and promotion in general. But I also really love IT. So I did my best to kind of marry the two when I worked on my dissertation at the University of Georgia. So my dissertation research was on telehealth implementations and various aspects of that, organizational implementation from, the actual consultation and what could lead to more successful consultations in the telemedicine space. My work experience in academia is, I'm here at Colorado State University, but before I came here, I worked at the University of Arkansas in the Walton College of Business for a while. And that's actually where I was exposed more to ERP, because that's where my department chair asked me to teach ERP. And I was like, yeah, I've never touched an ERP. And he sent me to all sorts of training. And now it's 10 years later, and I've been teaching ERP for about 10 years now at the college setting, both undergraduate and graduate. And so I guess that's kind of me in a nutshell,
Great.
It's glad that we were able to connect and kind of get more of that industry connection with ERP.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is how we connected is through your class and having me join one of your classes to speak recently. So I appreciate that invitation. You may have already answered this question or alluded to it, but I want to make sure I don't gloss over or miss it. But how did you make that pivot from public health and undergrad and that sort of area of concentration to then IT? I know you said you had someone at the school, at your previous school, that asked you to teach ERP, but was there more to it than that, or was there already sort of a natural extension from the public health HR types of focus to general IT?
Well, since I was a kid, I really cared about health and well-being. I was in sports. I cared about nutrition. It's just kind of a weird kid like that, I guess. it seemed like a natural major to choose. And I even did a research fellowship at the CDC as an undergraduate. So I was really trying to, go all in.
Hmm.
This was the late 90s. And so that was when everyone was getting those AOL CDs in the mail and, to connect to the internet. And so it wasn't even really a choice, honestly, to go into IT. It just was the timing of how things were unfolding, in technological advancements and how it was permeating mainstream society, because I just got sucked in. I couldn't help it. I learned on my own how to develop websites, as a public health major, and got a part-time job doing that as well. So by the time I graduated, I was just, I was hooked. And my first job was as a web developer. So,
Yeah.
I don't know that there are connections between public health and IT for sure. At the time, I didn't know it. So, when I did my fellowship at the CDC, it's when I really understood what public meant in public health, and I was like, oh, public, that means people, like a lot of people, not even just, one-on-one, like in healthcare where you have just a patient. Public health deals with populations of people and population health. And I understood very clearly that there was no way to go into that field and not have to work with people just all the time. And so, I was like, web development, super fun. I'm just sitting there at my desk and playing around on the computer. And public
Right.
health is just lots of complexity, lots of people. Little did I know, though, that the field of information systems and IT actually deals with a lot of people too. So it was just a naive, misunderstanding my part at the time. But now I understand that there's actually a lot of overlap.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like there's probably more similarities than either of us realized along the way.
Yes, for sure. And I think even the pandemic, probably showed a lot of that too. People's resistance to change and
Yeah.
misunderstandings about innovations, even though they're in the medical field. Um, it's all very similar,
Right.
similar stuff.
Right. Well, before I jump into some of the questions here, I'm gonna get to your research here in a moment. Just some of the
Mm,
research you've done, and just kind of what have you learned in this space over the last couple decades. But before I do that, I just want to give a quick shout out to some of the audience members that are joining here today. Tatiana from Los Angeles, Jerry from Toronto, Jennifer from Southern California, Dennis from India, AWB Solutions from Philippines, and Gassan from Middle East. We got someone from Mexico. We got a 49ers fan. I'm not sure why we'd have a 49ers fan on the
that's cool.
on the on the on the session here today, but just kidding. That's Tatiana, who's the 49ers fan, and and of course Kyler on the line as well. So thanks everyone for letting us know where you're joining from today. It's always good to see where in the world everyone is here today. And again, be sure to drop any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll be sure to get to your questions as we get going here. So this is a really broad question that could go a million different directions, and I fully acknowledge it. It may not be fair as a first question or a first real question for you, but
Okay.
I'll ask it anyway and see if we do maybe a flyover view or a summary. But when you think about the time you've spent in IT and the research you've done as in the world of academia, um,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of the biggest takeaways or lessons that you have from the things you didn't know 20 years ago when you started doing this stuff till now? What are some of those biggest lessons learned or takeaways from your research?
Yeah. So I'm a big picture thinker like you, so I think I might start more at the big picture level,
Sure.
and then where it's brought me today. And so, I started my PhD in 2006. Um, in the very first year of my PhD program, we have to learn a lot of fundamentals about research, about our discipline, and so, my discipline being information systems. And a lot of people confuse information systems with computer science or computer engineering, and don't really understand the difference. And where I am right now, it's actually, my department is computer information systems, so it makes it even more confusing. But what was really clear, in that first year of my PhD program is understanding, of course, what is information systems as a discipline? What does it mean? And our discipline is essentially captures the combination of people, processes, and technologies, and how they all have to come together, work together to manage information to achieve organizational goals. And ideally shared goals, right? is what we want. Still, at that time in 2006, the field as a whole was a bit disrupted. Around that time, it was after the dot-com bust, and there were declining enrollments, not just in information systems, but also computer science and other computing fields. And so we were all kind of in this identity crisis, really trying to understand, how can we remain relevant and serve the needs of the future. So in my field, there were a slew of publications around that time, or they had come out a few years earlier when I had started the PhD program. So they were still fairly fresh. And it was kind of, who are we? What kind of things are we supposed to teach and publish? The battle was really more of this holistic information systems. Are we all of this? Because, isn't that more management? Isn't that psychology? Isn't it all these other disciplines? And so we did really hone in on the tech. I think that's what really won the day in that feud about who are we as a field. And so subsequently, every paper you submit to a journal that about your research, there is this question: where's the IT artifact? Are you talking about IT at all? Because if not, maybe desk reject. We don't want to hear it. And I get that. I get that in terms of, in a business college, we have to differentiate ourselves from management, from other disciplines. My sense now, all these years later, is it was a pretty big mistake for our field to take that turn, because it's really in the holistic space of people, processes, and technology, and how they have to work together synergistically in a really careful dance, almost like a marriage. That's where innovation really takes place. Once you take the IT out of the people and the processes and try to look at it alone, you miss out on a lot of the things that your firm is trying to do, right? When you're talking about these major organizational IT implementations, it's not just about the IT. In fact, it's usually the IT is not the problem. It's usually right in the people and the processes and that space. And unfortunately, I do feel a lot of researchers who have been responsible for kind of researching this and teaching it and innovating in this space have done exactly what industry has done, and that's look at the tech, kind of, and not look at the whole picture.
Yeah, it's easy to become enamored by the technology and focus on bells and whistles and innovations in the pure tech space without looking at the people and process.
Absolutely. I mean, we still will look at things like tech's impact on organizational performance, and our outcome variables are still very relevant to a business. It's just we're not looking at our models holistically to account for a lot of the people and processes too, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a good point, and that's a lot of what we want to talk about, especially the technology and people in particular. I think that's a lot of what we'll cover here today. Of course, processes fit into that as well. But in speaking of that, I guess just to kind of shift gears and maybe dive into that a little bit more, part of your research, I know, focuses on how IT impacts individual identities and cultures. Just what are some of your high-level observations or thoughts or learnings in that area in terms of how tech affects or transformation affects, we'll call it digital transformation affects individual and identities and cultures, and vice versa as well.
Yeah. So, when I first started to do research in the organizational space, I was really interested in organizational culture. And so I started a study, it's a longitudinal case study. This was actually looking at libraries, because at the time, it was 2006, yeah, 2007. I had access to a particular case, a library that had been built and open, and it has no books. It was intentionally designed to be a bookless electronic library, still a physical space, but looks very different when you walk into it. And that actually meant everything. So we were looking at culture, in terms of how did the librarians adjust to this, and what does it mean in terms of their culture as an organization in this bookless library. But what we actually found was, I say we, I have one collaborator at the University of Georgia, Dr. Marie Boudreau. We found was that their identities, within the culture space, identity really became a prominent theme, in their identity threats and how they responded to those identity threats. So, culture is very important, but I think where my research has taken me is that within the culture space, identity is almost everything, because it deals with who we are as human beings, even in the workspace. Who are we as a librarian, if I'm a librarian. And the threats to that, I found that, we all respond to identity threats. We all have usually our default is some sort of defensive or protective type of response to start. And that's exactly what they did as well. They were really trying to say, hey, we're still relevant in this space. We're not going to be one of these groups that gets sucked into de-skilling because of technology. We want to make sure we're still relevant. But no matter what they did, they could not combat the misperceptions of the people they were serving. So it didn't matter how often they put up, say, read posters, for example, of celebrities reading books in the building. It didn't matter how often they had a portable bookmobile for checkout, or all the things that they tried to do to say, hey, we're still librarians and this is a library, so please use it like a library instead of a computer lab. It just didn't work. It didn't work. They try to even, change the desktops on the computers to be more like, hey, you're in a library, but their patrons still looked at them like directional assistants at the desk. Would still ask, where's the bathroom, where's the stapler, and these are people with master's degrees or higher. They are very skilled in their expertise. So what we found is that when the masses kind of when it becomes imbued more in the societal culture, because this wasn't the only place where it's becoming digitized and, as a library, and you're now going to databases, right, to look at research. You're not pulling books and journals from the shelves and photocopying anymore. That's just not the behavior that the patrons are engaged in. So when that happens, there's really no stopping the train. It doesn't matter what, as an organization, you try to do to say, hey, we want to resist this, or say, it's still this old model, or, so what they had to do was essentially embrace it. They just had to. They had to make it a part of who they are. So they had to adapt their identity to this new technological landscape, because that's the only way to stay relevant. And even though this was a case study, a longitudinal case study with a library and librarians, I do think the lessons gleaned from that case study are generalizable. The way that consumers, the way that it's just all baked into our societal culture, technological adoption, there's no stopping that train, really. I think organizations just have to embrace it, have to respond to it, have to understand the employees that they onboard that are even younger generation. I mean, it's different. There's a different culture.
Yeah.
And so culture, identity, it's all very much tied together.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great point. And actually, Sam Graham on LinkedIn has an interesting related question, which is, to what extent is organizational culture affected by the culture of the country that it is in? For
Mhm.
example, he worked in a country where it's considered rude to say no. And so how do you navigate, some of those geographic cultures? Because I think what you're talking about is more just the culture of an organization or
Right.
the individual trace of a individual. But how does a geographic culture affect all this?
Oh, for sure. And I encourage Sam to take a look at. There's a website on well, this was actually national culture. So I think that's what he's talking about, though, country culture too. Uh, Hofstede is a big name in that space, and there are researchers who will take some of his research with a grain of salt. But that's any research, truly anything that's produced by humans. You know that there's going to be some flaws in it, but if you look up Hofstede national culture, you'll find that it's even searchable. It's a really great website because you can compare national cultures as well. And so for example, it would put United States um, as a highly individualistic uh, that's in our culture.
Right.
It also says that in the United States we have more of a short-term orientation instead of a long-term orientation. So that even filters into how we have quarterly reports and shorter reporting times for some of our goal settings. Uh, but there's these lots of different dimensions, even masculinity to femininity, and that's why some of this is been questioned, but it's been research out there for decades, and so I would encourage them to check that out. But it does definitely have some impact for sure.
Yeah.
Even in the pandemic, we saw that, right? I think that some societies that were just inherently more collectivism in their national culture, the way that they responded compared to countries that were much more individualistic in their culture, just totally different, right?
Hmm.
um, i don't I don't know that there's a whole lot we can do to change something as big as national culture. But what Sam is saying is, like, it's considered rude to say maybe no in a culture. I mean, I think all we can do is kind of more educate ourselves and um, ask questions. That's all I have for that. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this kind of builds on a point that you just mentioned as far as one of the dimensions of culture, with masculinity and femininity.
Mm.
And this question is from Kyler on LinkedIn, who asks, in honor of National Women's Day, which I didn't know it was National Women's Day. So good to know. Thanks, Kyler, for pointing that out. And building on identity, how is women in technology shifting and cultural misperceptions transitioning?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if we're seeing a huge increase in women, flooding to STEM fields yet, but there definitely has been an uptick in efforts, in recruiting and trying to be more mindful of what are the barriers. Even at CSU, the computer science department and my department, computer information systems, we received a joint grant through Northeastern University. It's from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to increase, women enrollment in our programs, so our concentrations, our certificate programs. Um, I mean, there's more awareness about it. I don't know yet if we've totally untangled all of the barriers truly. What are the real reasons that are preventing women from maybe even choosing this as a concentration or a career, but also retention. So keeping women in these fields is also difficult if they choose it to begin with. That they'll tend to leave, so turnover can be high. uh, it's getting better. That's all I can say. It's getting better. We're working on it. I hope to see a lot of improvement in this area in the next, hopefully, 10 years.
And I imagine it's a lot of variation in different parts of the world and different cultures of how far that's come along versus not. And maybe in 10 years, we get a little bit more even in terms of how we've evolved
Yeah,
there.
I think so. I mean, what we're finding is that the interventions that we would implement to increase women enrollment actually just increases enrollment, period, across the board, across all demographics. So I think the barriers preventing women from choosing these careers are also preventing a lot of other people, whether they're women or not, from choosing these careers. A lot of it has to do with stereotypes, myths that we have to debunk about STEM fields. So it's a lot of work to be done, honestly.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, we I may have unintentionally stirred some controversy on YouTube. I think what he's saying, Nanudin on YouTube is saying, I thought it's International Women's Day, not National Women's Day. So if I misspoke there, thank you for the correction. I'm not sure if it's national, just a U.S. thing, or if it's
Oh,
international.
sure.
But point's still the same though, as far as women involvement in technology. Um, so here's another question that's actually going to lead into a question that we have here on LinkedIn that I want to get to, but I kind of want to segue into it. But the question is, when you and I talked, kind of preparing for this interview, you talked a little bit about the neuroscience of human behavior and change. And I'll fully admit I'm getting way over my head here as we talk about neuroscience.
Well,
And
I'm not a neuroscientist either. I want to be very clear.
okay, you probably know more about it than I do, but
Okay.
which isn't saying a lot, I suppose. Um, but when you look at neuroscience and human behavior and change, what are some of your learnings or observations in that realm?
Yeah, so what I'm learning is that research is just really coming out about some of this now, so if you looked to the research before 10, 20 years ago, uh, even the capabilities to conduct this research were not nearly as robust as they are now. So it's been about, I want to say about 10 years in the information system space that we've had this sub discipline that's kind of emerged. There's this sub sort of research area, and it's called NeuroIS. And there are even colleges of businesses in the world now that have these more neuro kind of labs for research. So they're equipped with, EEG, eye tracking, other types of biosensing data that can track like heart rate, perspiration. There are some researchers in IS now getting into studies that leverage fMRI technology for brain scanning. Obviously, we have to do a lot of partnering with other disciplines in medicine to be able to best interpret this data and understand what it means. But all of that kind of stemmed from most behavioral research, is subjective, in the way that we measure it. We get a lot of self-report data, perception-based type data on surveys, or, we might observe behaviors, but then we're not really in the minds of people to understand, what's making them behave that way. So I'm really excited that we're getting into, that's the nice thing about Moore's Law, right? Is that we are getting even better brain scanning kind of tech to be able to use for research, even some, like EEG that's portable now. So we'll be able to have people wear these sort of nets. Maybe there's a way they can hide it, but, it connects to their brains, and it can be scanning, more continuously or all day. So they can, we could see how they actually interact outside of a laboratory space, with the technology they're using. How is it while they're driving? How, when they're shopping in a store, versus when they're at home. So across context, it's really exciting. So that's number one. Is that we're just really now starting to see this research come out from a more neuroscience standpoint of behavior change and what triggers it. Two, I mean, I think there's just a lot we're going to find out, honestly, because of that in the next 5 to 10 years, about the way humans really tick, the way their brains tick, and how this bleeds into the organizational space, and how people even work together. I mean, forget technology, how do just people work together in teams and make that collaboration work so we can have innovation. Um, I believe, because you and I have talked, so this isn't based on any fMRI data or anything or any studies that I've done. So I just want to make that clear. It's just
Sure.
based on a lot of what I've read from studies that have been done and what I've observed in my own research. Is, I think that, people have inherently, I think this is nature, different types of processors in their brains, and we don't know it, we don't even realize it. We're talking about things now, unconscious biases, implicit biases, and things like that, that, you know, over 90%, of the decisions we make are unconscious, and we don't necessarily know why. We're kind of operating off of different scripts we've developed. Um, so I think that once we start looking under the hood a little bit more, so to speak, and the way that our brains work, we're going to find out that a lot of organizational conflict probably stems from people who think differently. They have different thinking orientations, and they just don't even realize it. It's almost like we're speaking different languages, but we don't even know it.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're touching on this whole thread or this whole thought that there's so many complexities and layers of the complexities of change in terms of the people impact, because you have sort of you have call it the geographic culture, or sort of the broad based culture of wherever the organization is, or, whatever country or religion, or, whatever the location is. And then below that, you have the culture of the organization, which could vary even in the same geography. And then within that one organization with that distinct culture, you have individuals now with different things that make them tick, and different psyche, things that motivate them to change or not.
Yep.
So
Yes. And so it's really interesting because, I think we just really never talked about it at all before. We just, now there's a little more openness and transparency. So I see this as a professor in the last 10 years. There's definitely more of an openness, say, even of students, divulging, different information about the way that they might process information, or, issues that they might have. And so, we've had huge increase in accommodations that we provide for students, and in that space, they're referred to as disabilities, but truly I don't think a lot of these things are actually disabilities. I think this is just people who are oriented differently, they think differently, they might for example, I think there are some people with ADHD, for example, who are diagnosed, who might just have a different relationship with time, perceive it a bit differently than others, and process it differently in their brains. I don't know that that's necessarily a disability, but it is something to accommodate in a space where we're trying to use these sort of one size fit all approaches to how, we teach and how we do different things in organizations. We want to have a policy that works for everybody. We want to have, processes that work for everybody. But instead of, thinking about at the individual level how people are going to have different needs in the processes, we try to sort of retrofit the people to the processes. So some get accommodations, some kind of fit, some, and in my mind, I'm like, I don't know that that's really the way to do it. I think we can design our processes much smarter, so that they do just naturally accommodate everybody, no matter where they come from or what they're bringing to the table.
right.
But that requires process reengineering and rethinking the way we do things and changing status quo and norms. And that's just really hard.
Scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of what you do and consult on, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you said it well when you said there is no one size fits all approach to change, and nor can there be when you look at those three layers of overall culture, organizational culture, and then individual motives. So that's a great point. So maybe building on that a bit more, here's a question from Andre on YouTube. He asked the question of how adaptable are individuals in high power distance societies insofar as ERP and IT and digital change is concerned. Do you have any
Oh,
thoughts on that?
goodness. Wow, that's a
Good
rough
question.
one. I didn't expect that one. Thanks, Andre. Okay, so high power distance. So that would mean there's there's more authority and there's more respect for authority in high power distance cultures. They're very hierarchical. Um, you know, and it's interesting because I think in the United States, for example, if you look at Hofstede's website, I'm guessing I have to look at it, but if I had to guess, it would probably say we have more of a low power distance culture, meaning, there's a lot more individual freedoms. There's more, participative input, it's more democratic, all these sorts of things. What I find though is that even if at a national level you might have that stipulated as a culture, that doesn't mean that's what's represented in organizations, right, in that culture. And you see that in the United States a lot too, where we still do have hierarchical kind of structures, with power distance in organizations. The CEO is always going to have more power than someone who's just newly onboarded as a newcomer to the organization, fresh out of their degree program. But yes, in high power distance societies, I would say that he says how adaptable are individuals. I think that it would in some ways also hinge on how faithful, I guess, that society can be to that particular element, that dimension of culture. In a very strict standpoint, I would say high power distance, that would mean that authority is respected, and if they do have that respect, then they can make their followers adapt, when they need to adapt. But that only works, when the individuals are willing to follow that authority and that power. And I think that it's one thing to see something in theory, in a model with boxes and arrows and whatnot, but seeing it instantiated in practice, in reality, in the way that humans actually, in our real worlds, it usually doesn't work that cleanly. So I
Yeah.
would say, yeah, I would say, yeah, could be really adaptable if that high power structure is really respected and ethical, right? And so the people buy into it. But if there's doubts, if there are doubts, just like in an organization, right, among the followers about what those in power are deciding the humans need to do to adapt, then you'll still get that resistance. And if they're too controlling or too kind of authoritarian in the way that they try to implement that change, you also might get resistance, but again, that's from individuals who might be like, that's not ethical, right? Like I want to follow leaders and authority who have my best interests at heart too.
Yeah. It also seems like you might have a higher resistance to change or more of a change issue if your organizational culture, especially in Hosted's model, is different than the national culture. So in other words, as you're talking, it made me think, well, if I'm an American, which I am, I'm in the US and I'm used to this lower power distance sort of approach, but I
Yeah.
work for an organization that's more command and control. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if that dissonance between like the organizational culture and the
Oh,
country culture,
absolutely.
that could create more problems.
Absolutely, it would, because what my research is taking me to is the individual level. I mean, I know we're looking at a lot of things more at the macro level, but it all starts more at a local level, and at an individual. And this might have a Western bias because that's a lot of the research I look at. It's all stuff published in English and stuff like that. But at least what I've been reading would indicate that individuals, even as employees in organizations, are moving towards a place of wanting more authenticity in the workplace, wanting to be able to align their personal values, all the way up to, org, national, they want that alignment, you know what I mean? Because when you have all those conflicts, that's where things really do fall apart. So, if a person has high moral values in terms of, say, equity or fairness, and that's something they really feel strongly about. If they don't see that being enacted in their organization, in which they work, they may end up jumping ship. I think we're seeing a lot more turnover in organizations now, as people are kind of like, you know what, I really want to find a place that aligns with my values too,
Yeah. Yeah. So that alignment is important. I suspect, and that's something I hadn't thought of before. And then the other dimension here that this sort of, or another semi rabbit hole that this takes my brain down, is when you think about the effect that this all has on people, and just how what the overall impact is, and how the culture is affected by that. Um, how is resistance to change? How does resistance to change manifest itself in that? I mean, in terms of, let me rephrase it. Maybe I'm having trouble getting this thought out, or this question out. But when you think about the way you might want to change your culture, let's try this. If you recognize that you're a command and control
Mm-hmm.
authoritarian type of organization, in theory, and if that's aligned with your national culture, in theory, maybe people will change because it's aligned with the culture they're used to. That's the way the organization is. You tell them to change, and they're gonna change. I'm oversimplifying,
Mm-hmm.
but that same organization may say, well, maybe we should be a little bit more collaborative, or a little bit
Mm-hmm.
less power. What's it called? A little lower power distance as a
Right.
culture. You're not going to change that overnight. So how do you see culture potentially
Mhm.
evolving as a result of the digital transformation or an IT initiative?
I mean, I really think, I mean, you might not like this answer, Eric, but I think it's, your work and organizations that do the kind of work you do are going to become really, really important in the next 10 years. I mean, you've been important, but as we see, technology is rapidly accelerating. We're talking about exponential growth, and so it's just going to get faster and more complex. And it's already been difficult for us to adjust to. So I imagine in the future, it's going to become even more challenging. So those who do more of what you do are going, you might have to, and we can maybe talk in another meeting, but I think that, there might be some additional things you might have to bring to the table, to organizations to really help smooth some of these transitions. Um, because, we talk a lot at the macro level, but I think everything we see at the more macro level are, um, side effects or downstream effects from what actually happens at the individual level,
Mm,
in each employee, in each individual citizen in a society, because we're the ones who come together and then create these macro phenomena together. Uh, but until we can get more at the individual level, people willing to change, I mean, there's a reason New Year's resolutions never go well, generally speaking. I mean, this is forever, year after year, this never changes. Uh,
right.
so it's something that really needs to be tapped more at the individual level. And like you said, there's no cookie cutter solution. There's no one size fits all. So it's going to have to be something that we have to figure out how to, more on an individual basis, understand what barriers exist, for humans to change and evolve. And um, I don't think all of it exists in the business space. Again, this is my big picture thinking. I look at our inputs to organizations come from somewhere. They come from our K through 12 systems. They come through our college or higher ed systems. All of that has to adapt to the needs of the future, and preparing our young learners, for the needs of the future. But then we also have the folks like you and me and those older than us, some of us who've lived in a world where it's not this frenetic. It's not, we do remember a slower pace and when we could fax things and it wasn't all instantaneous, um, and we have to adapt too. We have to understand we're not living in the 1970s anymore or the 1980s, and there's never going to be a way to bring that back. It's like that ship has sailed.
Right.
So,
For better or worse, it's not coming back.
yeah, but I think it has to be more at the individual level. And I do think that some of what we were talking about before about convergent thinking, divergent thinking, this is all stuff that's going to have to come to the table. Um, and that's kind of akin to these ideas of vertical thinking and lateral thinking, which, again, deals with your space and ERP, right? In fact, the textbook I've used for years and years called it sideways thinking, for like lateral thinking, and saying that all employees, like, this isn't just a management level requirement. All employees in an organization have to develop that sideways thinking or lateral thinking, being able to understand where, whatever they're doing in the organization, what comes before, what comes after, what are the impacts of your work on everything else in the organization. Because when we have people who are too vertical in their thinking, too convergent, we can get really high specialization and real high expertise, which is awesome. But it makes them blind to, the impact of that specialization, what they're doing and how it bleeds into the rest of the organization. So I don't know exactly how to change that, because I think some of that is more at the innate level, and some of how we're wired to think. But I think there are ways that we can, teach different ways of thinking, because I think no matter what our predominant orientations might be, we are all going to have to learn to be more than ambidextrous, in the way that we think, so that we can, invoke the right thinking tool set, in the moment. If there's something that requires a bit more creativity in the moment, do we know how to take that tool out of our toolkit and have that more creative thinking enacted? If we have to be a little bit more focused and vertical, do we know how to pull that tool out of our toolkit?
And what about convergent and divergent thinking? You mentioned that to me when we spoke before, in preparation for this discussion, and I found it super fascinating and super relevant to
Yes.
this whole world of transformation, digital transformation. So maybe help us understand what's the difference between the two, and how is that relevant to what we're talking about here today?
Yeah, and so when I say convergent thinking, this is also, you see it a lot more in this vertical thinking space, and it's more of, you're given a set of facts and information, and so both are problem solving types, ways of thinking.
Okay.
And so in convergent thinking, you're kind of given the information at the outset, but it's still complicated. You still have to figure out the right solution from all of those different facts. But there's usually one solution, like you're converging, right? You're focusing. Divergent thinking, on the other hand, is, you might not be presented with all of the facts and information you need to solve a problem. You're given a particular prompt, and you're given a goal, like, this is what we're going for. And then you have to go forage, explore, and figure out what different facts and what different solutions might be relevant. So you might not come up with you come up with many, many different solutions to try to figure out which one might be the best, or maybe there's a whole set, right? That more than one answer can be right at a time, right? And that is just difficult for humans to accept. Even in politics, right? It's there's always like, oh, my side's right, no, my side's right, and it's very seldom do we have people saying, actually, it's all right. It's there, but we just have to pivot, twist, slice, dice, same things we do with data, right? To understand when this is right and when this is right. So, siloed thinking, right? Organizations are siloed. They specialize. They have an accounting department. They have their HR department. They have, and that's just how organizations have been. I don't know. I imagine that's how yours might be too. Divided. You have specialists. But anytime you have that really specialized knowledge, that it's going to really promote that vertical thinking instead of integrated. And instead of more divergent and lateral, sideways thinking. So I think some of it is just bringing this language to bear in organizations and saying, hey, these are things we have to work on. All individuals have to kind of work on both of these, because it's not like, oh, divergent thinking is better or lateral thinking is better. They're both really great, and they're both tools we should be sharpening.
Yeah, that's really well put and a good summary. And it seems like that in our industry at times it feels as though the convergent thinking or the vertical thinking is pushed a lot more. In other
Yes.
words, when you're a software vendor or a system integrator that specializes in one technology, that's the right answer, in your mind or in that
Yep.
world.
Standardized tests, even, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's going to education, but there's always one right answer, right? On those, that you bubble in or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's even baked into our education systems. It's baked into how we teach people how to think. So that's something that, yeah, it's complicated. What you deal in is complicated because it's not just at the organizational level. There are impacts outside of organizations, even regulations and laws, and all of that will have an impact on how effectively an organization can change.
Yeah, absolutely. And you helped me understand why, as a kid, I always struggled with multiple choice tests. I really struggled with them because
There you
to me, there
go.
wasn't one answer. I always felt
Yeah,
like there's two possible answers here. It
yeah,
depends. Um,
absolutely. Me too.
and that's way, I would say people going through a transformation while you want to have some specialization, whether you're a technical person or business process or change management or program management, whatever it is, you need that specialization, but you also have to, I think, challenge yourself to be more divergent and look more integrated at the whole big picture. Because I think that's where we mess up is we focus so much on our myopic little areas, and these are big, massive transformations, and we don't get it right typically when we take that approach.
Right.
Yeah, good stuff. There's another question I wanted to get at here, which I think is really interesting. This is from Gassan on LinkedIn. He asked, as companies become legacy with staff turnover for key positions at approximate 0 years, does organizational change resistance increase, whether intentional or unintentional? Has this been measured? So I think that, maybe to paraphrase or try to paraphrase, as organizations bring in newer, fresher, younger blood, whatever you want to call it, newer people to the organization, how does that affect resistance or acceptance of change? Have you seen any correlation there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, turnover is very disruptive to organizations. I mean, I see it now, even in my own organization. In the pandemic, there's been a really high turnover, and even when you bring in new people, it's all of that conflict you're talking about. Is that value alignment there? As you bring in new individuals, are you also bringing in a wave of new types of values, that are reflected in a different generational space, and so I think it all depends. I hate to always give those answers, right? Like, it depends, but it
Right.
does. It depends on, the culture of the organization to begin with, and the culture that the incomers are bringing to the organization. But I would say, in general, frequent turnover is not something an organization wants, because you can't keep your knowledge in place. That core knowledge base you might need, and I don't know. It's something about, it has something to do with culture and identity and this research, because that all of that takes time to really form and solidify. And so when you have all of this, like these micro disruptions and stuff that punctuate that process, it's really hard to forge like a good culture and identity. Um, at the same time, my ethical values would tell me that uh, I think it's fine for people to leave organizations, right? And to try, new careers but at the same time, yeah, it does cause a bunch of disruption. I think until we can get systems, human resource systems that are more resilient, meaning, we have better systems where if somebody needs to tap out, someone else immediately taps in who can fill in, we can allow people to tap out more and, take the breathers that they need or go back to school or the things that we all want as humans to grow, um, without making them feel like, oh, I can't do that because maybe there's going to be negative consequences. If I leave, maybe they're not going to have someone for however long it takes to onboard someone new. That's the reason I don't leave a lot of times from organizations, because I understand the burden it's going to put on my colleagues until they find a replacement. So yeah, I don't know. I don't even know if I really answered that question well, but hopefully I
Yeah.
gave them some insights to help.
Well, just another dimension that you have to think about as part of a transformation. I mean, you talked about layers of culture and individual motives and behaviors, and then you've got this whole thing with turnover and how tenured is the staff. That affects your culture, which affects how resistant or open to change that organization is going to be. So there's just so many moving parts you've got to consider in that
Right,
roadmap.
right. Yeah, because I think that the best change is enacted. Yeah, I know we always talk about buy-in and everything. I think that's all in the literature. But when there's genuine buy-in, but I think that buy-in has to come from a place not of leadership, providing the best, spiel about why they need to embrace change. I think it needs to come from a place within each individual person of being like, I value this. I value innovation. I value my company trying something new. I value learning new skills, so maybe I have to change my job role. Maybe I do, but I value learning and growing. So, like, I'm going to go with it. Until we can get more of that, I think we're going to have problems with change, no matter the context.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
One question that's a little bit off track from the thread, Ron, but I want to make sure we get to it before while we still have time here, and that is, and you mentioned this to me when we were prepping for the interview. You mentioned this to me in sort of in passing, so we didn't really dig into it very much. But I wanted to ask the question because I feel like you might have been onto something that would be relevant here, which is the relationships between novices and experts within digital transformation or any sort of change initiative. Um, is that something you've studied or read up on, or what are your thoughts on? And I don't know if this traces back. I think you were talking about in the context of your public health experience, if I remember correctly, like doctors and patients.
Mhm.
But
Right. Yeah, I did
experts
study
and patients.
novices and experts in the telemedicine consultation space. It absolutely it does, and even using that word novice and expert. I get it. I think expert, we're talking about that vertical thinking normally, is like that is somebody usually who has expertise, say, in software development or um, in finance or, in medicine, it might be a specialty. And then the novice is someone who doesn't have that knowledge, that specific knowledge. Um, so what I'm finding is that those who exist more in the novice or follower space, that would even include citizens in a country, followers, uh, we have a lot of responsibility. We have a big job to do, and especially in this upcoming, drastically changing, exponential tech world we live in. Um, right now, I think where followers generally impede change is that, followers, and I'm going to put myself as a follower because I'm not, I'm not a CEO, I'm not a department chair, I'm not, I'll go ahead and say I'm a follower. you know, uh, we can't always expect leadership and authority to handle everything. We really can't. We have a responsibility as well to learn, to be curious, to empathize, to try to understand the perspectives of leadership as well. Um, but we tend to not do that. We're just not trained that way. It's not baked into our cultures all over the world. And so the way that bleeds into, the research I did in medicine is with telehealth is I interviewed numerous physicians across many different medical specialties, and they all consistently said patients are terrible information presenters. Terrible. So we, as a patient, will come to an appointment and we'll just expect the doctor to do everything, right? We expect them to ask the questions, run the tests needed, as though we have zero responsibility in this process. If instead, we were like, no, actually, housed in our brains is 90% or more of the information that healthcare providers actually need to help us, because that's also supported by research. Uh, the best way to diagnose a patient's condition usually comes from their medical history. And how does a medical professional know your medical history? You have to tell them, you have to bring that information to the appointment. Medications you're on. If you have a rash, did you take a picture of its development every single day? And did you come and bring that to the appointment? That would actually do a lot more to save people's lives than anything that a doctor can do. And that is cheap. That is actually not an expensive thing. And I think that in organizations, that's the thing that's almost maddening, and in society in general, because usually what's required is the cheapest, easiest, simplest solutions. Even just listening, for example. Imagine the money an organization can save if only each individual employee decided, hey, I'm going to listen a little bit more instead of just judge things right off the bat. But that's how it is. So, I think, as far as novices, experts, it absolutely, all of it will impede change. Even an expert, thinking, hey, I know best, could impede change. In the management research, there's a concept called reverse mentorship that's kind of making its way into a little bit of the mainstream. And it's this idea of, novices can actually mentor experts too. You know what I mean? It's not always the other way around. They have interesting, meaningful knowledge and expertise also to bear in an organization.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that if there's a way to divide the chasm between novice and expert, not that you expect the novice to become an expert or the expert to back up into being a novice,
Right.
but it seems like, at least in our world, and I think maybe this is true in the medical field and other industries too, but in the digital transformation world, we see the dynamic often where an organization almost has this learned helplessness. We're not the experts. This is a big disruptive change to our organization, so we're going to defer to you, third stage consulting, or you, system integrator,
Mm-hmm.
software vendor, or whatever expert you want to plug in here. We're going to defer to you to sort of fix this for us, and it creates this sort of like expectation that I don't need to bring any real meaningful input to the table. And on the expert side, you have sort of the opposite, which is, I've done this a million times. I've got the answers. I've seen organizations just like you, and this is how software should be deployed, or how you should, leverage a new
Mm-hmm.
technology or whatever. I'm oversimplifying two extremes here, but I think though that
Mm-hmm.
dynamic seems like that creates a lot of problems in the world of
Right.
transformation, blind spots.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a reason I'm doing what I do and not what you do. You know what I mean? What you do seems really hard.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and yeah, but I think if we can be more mindful of that, those differences, I think that's huge. So maybe just a sort of a capstone summary, sort of wrap up sort of question. What based on everything we've talked about and all your studies and just what you've learned about IT and change and digital transformation over the years, what are some of the key nuggets of advice you'd give to an organization that's about to start on a transformation or a change initiative?
Right. Well, I mean, I exist more in the IT space. And as far as digital transformation, IT implementations, I mean, honestly, the things I would tell them that bear out from research are a lot of the things that you say too. You know, when you say you wish you could just drop digital from the word transformation, for example, me too. Because it's I would say don't focus so heavily on the tech. If just don't. That's not where all of the problems lie. Also, consistently, time and time and time again, research does show that you can take adequate tech, decent tech, not even the most expensive tech, and pair it with exceptional people and processes, and you will get far superior results than any organization that puts the latest and greatest, most expensive tech in their organization. It means nothing if you don't have the people and processes that know how to exploit it and leverage it. So I would say people and processes is really, I mean, it's not the fun part, it's not the shiny sexy part of anything but that's where, if you want to be successful, right, if you're looking for results, that's where you need to focus your energy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I agree with you. And it makes you wonder if, every organization that's about to go through a transformation, if they were to just shift, say, 20, 25%, let's say, of their focus, resources, time, money on the technology, maybe buy 20, 25% less of what you're planning. Don't invest as much in the technology and shift some of that focus over to the people and process side of things. That I would take that bet every day, over that
Yeah,
company that throttles back on their tech spending and increases
that's
spending in the other areas.
that's what my dissertation research showed too. So in telehealth consultations, the most effective consultations, meaning they were able to diagnose the patient's health condition accurately, uh, that happened in an audio only condition. So this was a lab experiment. That happened with the lowest tech you can possibly have in that consultation, which is just talking like on the phone. But it was paired with an exceptional interviewer. So the expert had to be really high in their interview skills and diagnostic skills. So it's their process skills, like, what they're specialized in. And then on the novice end, the patient end, they also had to have really high presentation skills. So they had to be the patients who came with the photos with the rashes, who came with their medical history, so when you have those pieces in place, you only need really a phone, right? Because the information is exchanged through the humans in a very high quality way. But I don't think we think about that enough. And training people, I think it might be harder, but I think it would save organizations so much money instead
Oh,
of
yeah.
just trying to outsource it all to the tech.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah. That's a good place to leave it. I think if you're going to leave one nugget or if you take one thing away from this discussion, I think that's a really good place to leave it. Well, good. Well, thank you for being on the show. That it flew by, and I didn't get through all my
Okay.
questions. The audience we didn't get to all the audience questions either, and we could easily spend another hour on this. But I want to thank you for being on the show here, Christina. It's
Oh
great
my
having
gosh, thank you. And thank you for all the questions. And this was my first podcast for everybody listening.
you.
So thank you for joining me on my first podcast too. So
Now that we've finished the interview, I can maybe poke fun at you and say that let the audience in on a secret that you were really nervous about this discussion.
yeah.
But like I said, and I think the audience would agree. I don't want to speak for the audience, but you couldn't. I wouldn't have never guessed that you were nervous. So, which is
Thank you.
but thanks for being here, and thanks to the audience for asking great questions as well. So really appreciate that, and
Yeah,
we're
and
gonna.
they can easily find my email address on, a simple online search. So yeah, feel free
Yeah.
if anybody wants to reach out and talk more about any of this stuff. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, so Christina Serrano on LinkedIn too. That's another good place to connect with you, right? That's how we are
That's true.
part of how we're connected too. So you can Google her or search for her on LinkedIn as well. So thank you again for being here, and
Yeah,
for the
thank
audience
you.
here, we're going to take this interview to become part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which will be released a week from tomorrow. So be sure to keep an eye out for that. You get to see how the sausage was made by being part of the live production here, but we'll edit this up and polish it up and make it part of that finished podcast next week. So thank you for being part of that. So,
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll stay in touch. So yeah, I'll talk to you some other time.
all right, sounds good. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you all soon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.